The UN was created to solve external conflict, yet now the conflict has shifted to be within its walls.
Seeing no more business, I move the motion before the House that this House has no confidence in the United Nations. And our first speaker is an extremely hard-working member of committee, our press and spawn Ben Murphy, who will open the case for the proposition. So please welcome Ben, and with that I remain Hannah Edwards, Lincoln College, and your president.
I extend my utmost thanks to you, Madam President, for granting me the privilege of speaking on this motion tonight in this prestigious chamber. There is no doubt that the United Nations was founded with a grounded vision and a clear promise of peace and justice. However, as it expanded and developed, this vision has become a utopian fantasy that simply cannot be achieved. At its outset, it was an over-eager organization that has grown to vastly overestimate its power and influence and has reached the point where it simply is no longer effective in enforcing its aims. It is overextended and weak. It fails to fulfill the goals it was created to achieve. The UN was created to solve external conflict, yet now the conflict has shifted to be within its walls. But before I delve into why this House simply cannot afford to be complacent in our confidence in the United Nations, I must first introduce our opposition, as it is my duty and privilege. Our first speaker on the opposition is Shazmina Khan, who is a postgrad currently reading for an MSc in Global Governance and Diplomacy at Kellogg College, and our Women and Gender Minorities Officer here at the Oxford Union. Shazmina wants a career in government at the intersection between foreign and domestic policy, and is very qualified to do so, to say the least. She has a very active presence on social media and quotes that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So, what 1,000 words do the pictures quoting, "She got that independent wake up and make shit happen" type of vibe? And "she's a little sass and a lot of badass" mean exactly? Perfect quotes for a future career in politics, no doubt. Next we have James Kariuki, the UK Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN and former Multilateral Policy Director. He is a true diplomatic veteran of the UK and has led the British Embassy's political and economic relationship with the US in Washington and spent more than half of his career overseas. Speaking third, we have Angela Kane, the former UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs and the UN Under-Secretary for Management. Not only is her diplomatic wisdom soaring, but she also helped crack the case that caught the serial killer Charles Sobraj when in Bangkok with her husband. And finally, our speaker for the opposition is Lord Hannay of Chiswick, a British diplomat previously holding positions at the Foreign Office and in the UN. Lord Hannay is the only person in our chamber tonight to have been alive at the birth of the UN, and if the proposition has its way tonight, will be the only person here to have outlived it. An alumnus of New College, it is an honour to welcome him back to Oxford. Madam President, these are your speakers, and they are most welcome. The very name United Nations is misleading. United just isn't a valid term. Unity connotes common goals and aims, but there is no common good that the UN works towards. Every state has its own selfish motives. It is a temporary diplomatic agreement subject to the arbitration and whim of its members. The UN is a means to an end, not an end to a means. How can any organization be truly united if it is a breeding ground for self-interest and selfishness? There is no semblance of commonality or community. There is no united. Indeed, there is a sense of misplaced faith in the UN. Strength in unity is a quote rehearsed to us from our youth. Thus, the uniting of nations appeals greatly to the naive. But, alas, international organizations just don't work for the most part. The League of Nations, the historical predecessor of the UN, demonstrates this perfectly. Arbitrary power is always limited in its influence. The UN is optional. It may be a more developed version of the League of Nations, but its pitfalls are the same. It lacks influence and power over its members and is often ignored or circumvented entirely. Once a nation is part of the UN, it can eat away at the insides of the organization, as seen in the cases of Russia with Ukraine or China with Taiwan. It is decentralized, disorganized, and deadbeat. The UN is an organization that was founded with the intention to uphold peace and prevent conflict, at least on the surface. I mean, as a Brit myself, I don't doubt that the UN has been of great service to our country as a result of our permanent position on its Security Council. It would make sense why my opposition, as Americans and Brits, would therefore also want to defend the organization that has benefited them so dearly. But if you were to say, ask a Cambodian citizen, someone who lived in the times of the Khmer Rouge and the genocide, what they thought of the benefits of the UN, an organization that recognized and legitimized the regime, would they be standing in the opposition today? What about perhaps an Iraqi citizen who lived through the US-led invasion that was legitimized by UN Resolution 1483 under the false assertion that their government possessed weapons of mass destruction? The truth is, the UN is not an enforcer of peace, but an enabler of war and strife. It is a tool used by the Big Five on its Security Council to further their own ambitions. These 5 countries initially bullied and pressured their way into obtaining the power at the creation of the Security Council and have unjustly maintained it since. Time and again, they've abused this power to serve themselves and their own political ambitions rather than preserve peace and stability. Denied. Take the veto of Russia in the Syrian civil war. Despite several attempts to address the conflict by the UN, Russia vetoed every single one in order to protect its ally, Assad. The simplicity of the flaws of the UN are on display. All it takes is one of the Big Five to say no before the UN is rendered useless and its peacekeeping attempts nullified. I appreciate Mr. Kariuki's position on the matter. He recently testified in favor of the permanent addition of Japan, Germany, Brazil, and India to the Security Council and has mandated that the UK remains committed to never voting against a credible draft resolution on preventing or ending an atrocity. Unfortunately, the reality must be confronted. It only takes one vote. Adding countries will not solve the issue. It's not enough to reform the Council. It calls for greater action. The website of the UN states it endured the Cold War. Endured? Should that be what an organization aiming to promote peace be reduced to in a time of crisis? It can be maintained that it did usher in an uneasy peace between the superpowers of the USSR and USA, but was it peace? The Cold War caused many brutal and bloody proxy wars, such as Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan. Where in this was the intervention by the UN? Nowhere to be seen, as the major powers that sit on its council had political interests that were not peaceful. The UN is a playground for the bullying of the Big Five, not a protector of peace. It is a platform upon they are the arbiters of peace and the definers of morality. The power lies squarely within their hands. How then can we ever place the confidence in the hands of these arbitrary, selfish powers? I mean, the bullies of the UN make the very premise on which it is built a laughingstock. How can an organization created to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, as it is outlined in its charter, actually form an obstacle to intervention? In truth, the UN is built on irony and hypocrisy. Article 4 of the UN states that it is open to all other peace-loving states which accept the obligations in the present UN Charter and, in the judgment of the organization, are able and willing to carry out these obligations. It's far too easy to simply point out the many countries that stand as exceptions to this rule, yet retain their membership. But I would encourage you to look at the bigger picture. The founding countries of this organization, those central to its development, this Big Five, have had their part in more conflicts than the rest of the world put together. Our peace-loving neighbors across the pond have been directly involved in 32 separate conflicts since World War II, and we aren't much better. As a historian, I love a top 10 statistic. It helps me get through my tortuous 4 contact hours a week. It did trouble me, however, when I saw that the top 4 countries who have won the most battles in history, France, the UK, the US, and Russia, and the country that has been embroiled in the most internal conflict of any country in history, China, make up the 5 champions of peace that are the permanent members of the UN Security Council. How can an organization maintain dignity in its principles when it is built on such irony as this? Moreover, how can it be seen as a valid and legitimate arbiter of peace or justice? The UN is not an organization of unity, justice, or peace. No confidence can be placed in it. I therefore urge you all to vote proposition tonight. Thank you.